It is my goal this evening to share with you the science underlying the infection, what COVID is, how it actually infects us, what that means, why it is that vaccines are necessary, how they work, and how these specific vaccines work. And hopefully the most of the time will be spent answering your questions. But what I typically do is that I share some slides with you, and hopefully that helps to answer your questions. But, you know, as somebody who is a professor, that actually adds legitimacy to what I'm saying, since everything that I have on the slide actually has a specific source that's a recognized source. So I'm going to share my screen now with you, share my PowerPoint. And again, at the end, I will most certainly take your questions. So feel free to write those down so that you don't forget them. And as I'm presenting, feel free to turn on your devices so that you can actually, I can actually see you. All right. So the first thing I wanted to say here is that I have no financial interest in anything that I'm presenting on here. I haven't bought stocks into the vaccines. It is also not my goal to convince you to take the vaccine, even though at times it might feel that way. But I firmly believe that taking a vaccine like this is a personal medical decision that you should think through and pray through. And that you should make a decision from an informed place. And that's the whole idea of the presentation, that a lot of people are making decisions not to take the vaccine, but it's not coming from a place of information. It's rather coming from a place of fear. And there are lots of information out there that people present that can cause this fear. So just keep that in mind as we go along. I want you to start off by just pointing out some facts that if you're not a microbiologist and you're not in our area of specialty, you might not have thought about. The truth is that we have about 30 trillion cells in the human body that makes up our tissues and organs. Our red blood cells account for the vast majority of that. And then our other cells, our other cell types. But I want to point out that bacteria, the amount of bacterial cells in our bodies is way more than our own cells, right? In other words, we literally live in a sea of bacteria. And you might hear people talk about the human microbiome. And it's because we have bacteria all over our skin, in almost every organ in our bodies, and especially in our intestines. And studies have shown repeatedly that disruption of these microbes actually lead to disease, or what we call dysbiosis. That's why when you have certain intestinal issues, people tell you, oh, you know, you should get some probiotics. The idea of probiotics is to add back to the intestines what you might be missing. In fact, there are situations and conditions that you might have where they have to do a fecal transplant, which is a cutting edge technology. Why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you all of this to say that microbes are nothing new to the human body. We live and exist in a sea of microbes inside and outside of our bodies. And only about 1% of the microbes that we know lead to disease. So we get infected and have disease because our immune systems get overwhelmed by particular microbes that we have, not because you have a weak immune system. These microbes already know how to live inside of us, and many of them are opportunistic. In other words, if you have any sort of situation that reduces your immune efficacy, microbes that live in your system could actually take over. But for the most part, the good microbes that you have living all over your body, trillions of them, viruses, bacteria, some fungal microbes, they actually help to protect you from getting infected by the bad microbes. They compete with them actively for binding site. They compete with them for food and nutrients. And so when we do get sick, it is because of an overwhelming of the immune response. However, the human race has always dealt with pandemics. And from the time around 400 and something AD, they have been recording the fact that we do get outbreaks, either epidemics or pandemics. And on this chart, you're seeing all the way from 165 to 180, where about 5 million people, which was a huge part of the population of the earth at that time, died from what is called the Antonine Plague. Now, back then they didn't know about bacteria and viruses, so it's not clear which microbe this is that killed that many people. But over this extended period of time, a lot of people died. It could have been, smallpox, it could have been the plague, it could have been cholera, who knows? But as we come down, you see that people died from the Justinian plague and then the bubonic plague, probably the worst pandemic that we've ever had, spanning several years, ended up killing over 200 million people, right? So right now, we're thinking about COVID and how many people have died. This is 200 million people, smallpox, that ravaged populations for many, many years in the early 1900s and 1500s and coming down, end up killing 56 million people here. And then, of course, we have more closer outbreaks of cholera, for example. The cholera epidemic that started in India and then spread to the UK and from there to Canada and then in the US was devastating. And for those of you who are Seventh-day Adventists, Ellen White wrote about this. In fact, many people don't realize that this is actually what got Ellen White interested in the health message and infectious diseases, because they were living in New York at the time and saw how cholera ravaged people. And her son at the time got infected with cholera and almost died. And Ellen White, determined to understand more, she read voraciously about infectious diseases and pandemics and outbreaks and got really great insights before she started having visions about the health message. But then you have yellow fever and you have HIV/AIDS that we haven't thought about. But in 1918, a Syrian pandemic, the Spanish flu, infected and killed anywhere. People will give you ranges from 50 to 70 million people. And the reason they don't really know which one is because World War I was wrapping up at the time. A lot of people were dying. A lot of countries weren't reporting on the deaths for fear that it would be demoralizing to their armies. And as a result, it became known as the Spanish flu because Spain was the only country that reported the full numbers because they weren't a part of the war. So they didn't have those fears. So the coronavirus family is a family of microbes, of viruses that we've known about for a long time. In fact, the first coronavirus microbes were isolated in the 1960s at the University of Chicago by a researcher there. And they weren't even important enough to give fancy names. They were just given these alphanumeric codes, your 229E, your OC43, your HKU1. You can see that these are really names that came from just a researcher wanting to code something that you were going to stow away. And these cause the common cold. So it's very likely that in the past, before COVID-19, you got a cold and it was caused by one of these coronaviruses. But 3 times now, we've had deadly coronavirus members skip into the human family, into the human race. And we call these as zoonoses. Zoonoses because we're accidental hosts. They typically infect animals, and animals are the reservoirs. And if you notice, it's bats and rodents here that these are transmitted from. So for the first one, that was 2002, 2003, we had this outbreak of SARS that came into the human population, and it came straight from bats into the civet cats, which were the intermediate hosts, and then to humans. They were able to slaughter a lot of these civet cats that were infected with this, were able to stop the pandemic, but not before. Over 8,000 people were infected in many, many countries, and just under 800 people died. So that's a 10% mortality rate. And then right there at this point, and this is an important point to remember, right at that point, they started in earnest to try to make vaccines against these coronaviruses, because it dawned on us that if one family member could jump into the human population, you could have more. But because the pandemic ended so quickly and so suddenly, they weren't able to test the vaccines that they were trying to develop. Lots of different groups we're trying to make vaccines against this bug. And then just when people almost forgot it, in 2012, we had MERS, this Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. And this was a severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus. And that's an ongoing outbreak right now. The problem is that it came from bats into camels and is transmitted directly from camels to humans. We haven't seen any human-to-human transmission yet. However, it has a mortality rate of about 37%. And it's relegated to the Arabian Peninsula, where, of course, there are a lot of camels and people are still getting infected and dying from this. And then, of course, at the end of 2019, we heard about this new coronavirus outbreak. Not surprising to people who have studied coronaviruses that we had another outbreak of this. And that is what has put us here that we are today with the current coronavirus. You'll see this cartoon of the coronavirus with these spikes on it. And the word corona means crown in Latin. So that's where the family gets its name, because it has these spikes that looks like crown. So that's a cartoon. This is actually under microscopy, electron microscopy, and false colored here in purple, but you can see the spikes around it. Turns out that these spikes are really important to the virus because these are the keys that it uses to unlock your cells to get in. It's going to be really important to remember this. This is how the virus actually gets into our cells, into our bodies to infect us. So COVID-19 is coronavirus 19, as in 2019. SARS-CoV-2 is your severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. And from here out, I'll refer to it as SARS-CoV-2. But I want to show you right up front what this virus can do. This virus takes about 10 minutes from the time it enters to get into your cell. From the moment it attaches, it takes 10 minutes to get into your cells. And from that point, it takes about 10 hours to make over 1,000 or more progeny, which is what you're seeing here. So this blob here is actually a cell, a human cell. And the reason why you see these appendages coming off it is because it is very upset right now because it has become infected with this coronavirus and it can't kill the virus. So this cell is killing itself in a process called apoptosis. So that with the hope that it will also kill some of these viruses in the process before they're mature and they won't get to human cells. But I want to show you the sheer number. So all these yellow dots that you're seeing, these are SARS-CoV-2, these are the coronavirus that's on this cell. And that happens in 10 hours, which means in a 24-hour period, a single coronavirus could easily leave tens of thousands of viruses floating around in your system because of how rapidly they're able to replicate. And I want you to remember that because you're going to see that again. It is thought that this outbreak started in Wuhan, China, a bustling city where there's a lot of traveling in and out of it. And right at the time when this outbreak started, the Chinese New Year was just coming around. And so that could have helped a lot. I would typically tell you about the Chinese wet markets and how they could play a role. I'm going to skip that because it's not clear yet how this virus actually came about. But what we do know is that as of today, we have over 157 million people recorded infected. And just yesterday, just 2 days ago, a paper came out showing that that estimate is actually very low, that we have almost twice as many people worldwide who have become infected with SARS-CoV-2. And that the death rate, even here in the US, is vastly underestimated. And so we have 3.27 million people who have died from this coronavirus, 581 million of the, thousand of those in the United States. This is a serious infection by all measures. And what you're seeing, even though we're seeing a downward trend here in the United States, what we're seeing is that when you look at weekly new infections worldwide, it's going up. So his death, and that is in part due to what is happening in India, but it's not just India. We're seeing that in Laos, which is of course close by in Nepal and Thailand. Trinidad and Tobago, for those from the Caribbean, is having a hard time right now. Fiji and Cambodia. And I want you to notice that these are places that don't have half of the resources that most of these developed countries have. And what is happening in India right now could be an indication of what could happen in some of these very under-resourced countries. So this disease is basically initially a disease of the lungs. Your lungs are very important because that's where oxygen is exchanged, carbon dioxide as well. You're taking oxygen, you release carbon dioxide. So essentially the architecture of the airway looks like this. You have this bronchial tree just below the trachea. When you inhale, air rushes down into these compartments, get right down into the bronchial tree. And right at the end there, what you have are what we call the alveolar sacs. These are like bubble wraps when you squeeze them. And this is where the exchange of oxygen takes place. All of that oxygen that rushes in, there's so much of it, it saturates. And inside of here, you have a lot of blood vessels. And those blood vessels have red blood cells in them. And so the red blood cells are able to pick up the oxygen that you just took in, and they release carbon dioxide, which you exhale. And that's how we survive. Over here, you have a lung of somebody that has an inflammation or pneumonia. And if you notice, the major difference here is that because of that inflammation, these sacs that are empty over here that are ready to accept oxygen, they're filled now with fluid, with mucus. Because these sacs are lined by 3 major types of cells, and one of those cell types actually produce mucus in response to bacterial or microbial infection or inflammation, because the mucus is so thick that it traps microbes and actually prevent them from moving into the tissues. And so it's actually a part of your immune response, part of your inflammatory response. But when that happens, it makes it very difficult for you to breathe because oxygen can't diffuse through this thick mucus. And as a result of that, people typically end up having to be put on a ventilator. This is a 3D scan of somebody who had COVID-19. This is the George Washington University Hospital. And all of these yellowish green areas are the mucousy areas that you're seeing. The bluer areas are normal areas of the lung. And I want to point out 2 things. Number one, most times pneumonia affect one lung and one lobe of the lung. If you notice, COVID affects both sides of the lungs and multiple lobes of the lungs. And this was taken in this person before this person ended up on a ventilator. This gentleman actually ended up dying from COVID. But as you can see, the lung is filled with fluid. And so here's a CT scan of a normal lung and a COVID lung. Okay, all of that white area that you're seeing is actually that mucus buildup, which means that it's going to be very difficult for you to breathe, which means if you have any other underlying conditions that prevent you from breathing properly, you could now be in serious trouble, like COPD. Now, a lot of people have this binary view of COVID, where you get infected and you either survive and you're fine or you die. So we like to think about mortality a lot where infections are concerned. But epidemiologists know that morbidity can oftentimes end up causing way more money and way more pain, right? Morbidity is the sicknesses and the illnesses that persist and continue through for many, many months or sometimes for years, depending on the disease. In terms of COVID, what they're seeing is that there are a lot of things that people who survive COVID continue to have. 80% of people who survive COVID have at least one of these symptoms that I'm showing you here. Fatigue seems to be the major one. People have cough, headaches. People have can't taste or smell. They have memory loss, foggy. People start talking about having a foggy brain. You name it, joint pains, difficulty breathing. People have chest pains and arrhythmias. Your heart is not working well. And it goes on and on and on and on. We call it long COVID. Because way after you expect to be better, you continue to have these things. And a lot of these individuals, nobody know what the long-term effects are going to be. In fact, there are people now who have gone to the hospital, recovered from COVID. When they went back home, they came back to the hospital because they developed diabetes. They never had diabetes before, but now they developed diabetes. And I'll show you why. So here's the olfactory mucosa, just at the base of the brain, just above the nostrils there. And these red areas that I'm showing you, that's COVID, that's SARS-CoV-2. And this is a real patient. In other words, we haven't seen it in the brain yet because it's hard to do those scans, but they've seen it right at the base of the brain. The other thing is COVID tongue. You might not have heard about this. Cause these rashes and these papules to develop and these areas of indentation that you can see on the tongue of individuals. And that the period of time that lasts for varies widely. And then you see this gangrene because COVID actually leads to a lot of blood clots, right? Blood clots floating around the body, and even on blood thinners, these blood clots continue to develop. And what they do is that they block the small blood vessels that supply oxygen to these extremities, your toes and your fingers. And when that happens, these appendages die. So these individuals have to have these limbs amputated. Otherwise, they could run into problems of having infections that infect the rest of the body. What am I saying here? COVID is nothing to play with. You know, people have been saying, oh, only 2% of people get COVID die. It's just a numbers game. You know, when you have a lot of people, 2% of people of that lot of people is a lot. You know, 580 something thousand people in this country alone have died from this disease. So it can't be simple. Now, if you have certain underlying conditions, we know that COVID becomes worse for you. And unfortunately, a lot of people of African and African-American descent have these diseases, from diabetes and hypertension and obesity and cardiovascular diseases. And if you have two of them, the risk goes up exponentially. So any two of these you have, it pushes your risk of death from COVID and hospitalization to up to 90%. So that's significant stuff. And then when you throw in the variants, what are these? You hear people talking about variants. These variants are the fact that every single time that this virus actually replicates, it leads to mistakes. And this virus is actually a large virus. So it actually has what is called a proofreading system. In other words, it corrects its mistakes when he makes them. So the genetic material that make up this virus keep developing these mistakes, even with a good proofreading system. And as a result of that, every now and then the virus gets lucky. For most of the mistakes that it makes, it creates variants that die out. They're no more better than the original strain. So here's your original strain. You have the B117 strain that they first found in the UK, the P1 strain that they first found in Brazil, and this B1351 strain that they found in South Africa. What they're finding now in India is that they're finding a strain with double mutation from the B117 and the B1351 strain. And that seems to be one of the reasons that they're having this type of problem. But these strains, all that happens is that they make mistakes, and some of those mistakes get made in that spike protein, right? That spike protein that caused that crown look is what the virus used to get into your cells, as I said. And as long as it continues to allow the virus to get into the cell, it could actually evade the immune response. But more than that, for example, the B117 strain is known to be over 60% more contagious than the original strain, because it led to a mutation that made it more transmissible and that gave you more viruses per milliliter of mucus or air that you have. In other words, when you breathe out, you're breathing out more of it if you're infected, and it binds more tightly. And so that is the issue. And the issue is that if they change enough, and these are just the protein making building blocks that they're changing, that we call amino acids. And when it changes those, that could actually reduce the efficacy of the vaccines. And that's something you're afraid of. So again, here are those spike proteins. The spike proteins are what bind to what we call the human ACE2 receptor. So the spike protein, even though it looks simple, if you look closely, you realize it's a trimer. There are 3 protein spikes that come together to make this one structure. So for the immune system, this looks like a huge building, not just this tiny little piece. So the immune system is making antibodies or these protective proteins against several areas here. But here's what happens. You have this spike protein bind to this receptor that we all have on our cells called ACE2. It turns out that it was never made for COVID to infect us. It was there so that we could help to balance our blood pressure, achieve a level of homeostasis, and probably other functions that we haven't figured out. Here's the problem. And here's why COVID caused so much trouble in so many different organs and systems. These are all the organs and systems of your body that have receptors that ACE2 that COVID binds to. Okay, are you putting it together? COVID binds to ACE2 on our cells. And here are all the organs of the body that have tons of ACE2. From your nasal passage, of course, to the lungs, to your small intestines, the heart, the eyes, the liver, the bladder, the kidney, the brain, the pancreas. And so now you understand why people who have COVID come back with diabetes, because it destroys the islet cells in the pancreas that make insulin. And as a result of that, your body can't pick up the glucose that you take in to utilize it in the cell. And that's why some people end up with diabetes. But you also understand why some people end up losing sense of smell and taste, because the brain also has it. The testes have lots of receptors for this. So is the placenta. So essentially, this COVID is insidious. It's a systemic infection that easily gets into the bloodstream very quickly after it has infected you and can get into other parts of the body. Now, what I'm showing you is an animation of this trimer, this 3-part protein. And all of these black balls that you're seeing are where the mutation for the B117 or the UK variant is. This purple area is where the virus actually attaches to your cell. In other words, if you think about it as a lock and key, that's the part of the key that goes into the lock. And if you notice that it has mutations at different sites, but it has 3 mutations in that binding area where those purple blocks are, balls are. See, coming right now to the forefront, that's what it is. Yes, these 3 balls right here are the mutations. And that mutation led to this virus now being way more contagious. So I want you to look at the color of this diagram. This was November of 2020, when this strain was just coming into the UK. And look at how quickly, within less than a month, it became the dominant strain. And the UK moved from having a lower level of infection to having a spike in infection overall. And that's the strain that we're now experiencing all over the United States. And that's why in many states, like what is happening now in Oregon and what just happened in Michigan, that's why their numbers went up, because this is the dominant strain and it's way more contagious. That's what mutants do. I want to tell you about Manaus, Brazil, though, and they're just coming down the other side of this, because in 2020, in October of 2020, Manaus got infected with that original strain of the virus that came out of Wuhan, called the B strain. And so many people got infected. They estimate that about 76% of the population got infected. But this is a younger population. The vast majority of them are below the age of 50. And as a result of that, they didn't experience a level of deaths, even though they had a lot of deaths. And people started looking at this and thinking that they had what we call herd immunity that we're trying to achieve, that these people had just naturally achieved herd immunity. And then something happened. They started seeing an increase in hospitalizations in Manaus and an increase in deaths, starting right around February thereabouts. And when they looked, they realized that they had a new variant called the P1 variant that I just showed you. And this P1 variant started killing people, the very people who had been infected with the original strain and had survived it, were now dying. And the death was so much that, you know what this is? This is them clearing parts of the forest so that they could make a cemetery to bury people. And so look at the close-up of that. This is what it looks like. So this is what happens when you have a variant of a virus like this take over. It can very rapidly overrun an area. And this is what we're seeing in India now. That India was very lax in their policies, and now they have this variant on top of that, and it has caused this huge rise in India and in Nepal, following it, going up, where you're having so many people dying every day. They can't keep up. They're trying to burn these bodies, and the cities just smell of this burning, these morgues that are set up in the middle of it. And so that brings me to the whole importance of vaccines. The World Health Organization says that the two public health interventions that have had the greatest impact on the world's health are clean water and vaccines. And as an immunologist of more than 30 years, I completely agree that this is an important thing. And for those of you who are Seventh-day Adventists, this is from the Adventist Review. The Adventist Church is in favor of immunization and does not have any theological or religious reason not to encourage responsible immunization programs and their implementation. Adventist Church co-founder Ellen White took the smallpox vaccination herself and encouraged others to do so as well. At the same time, the church recognizes a person's right to choose and follow their convictions. The following is the guideline appearing on our church's official website, as well as the General Conference Health Ministries Department. And here's what it says. The Seventh-day Adventist Church places strong emphasis on health and well-being. The Adventist health emphasis is based on the biblical revelation, the inspired writing of E.G. White, co-founder of the church, and on peer-reviewed scientific literature. As such, we encourage responsible immunization, vaccination, and have no religious or faith-based reason not to encourage our adherents to responsible participation in protective and preventative immunization programs. We value the health and safety of the population, which includes the maintenance of herd immunity. This is the official statement of the church that you're members of. And this is the first time I'm putting this in a presentation to an Adventist group, but I feel it's important because a lot of people have different ideas as to what the church's doctrine is on this. And I can send you information that came down from the General Conference. But again, and that's why I don't come telling people that you should get vaccinated, but the church has a policy. And here is from D.E. Robinson, who was one of the secretaries of Ellen White, and was around at the time when Ellen White actually took the smallpox vaccine. This is what he says in Selected Messages, page 303, paragraph 6. You will be interested to know, however, that at the time when there was an epidemic of smallpox in the vicinity, she herself was vaccinated and urged her helpers, those connected with her, to be vaccinated. In taking the steps, Sister White recognized the fact that it has been proven that vaccination either renders one immune from smallpox or greatly lightens its effects if one does come down with it. She also recognized the danger of their exposing others if they fail to take this precaution. In other words, she wasn't just concerned about her and her family. And I told you how her son was exposed to cholera, and that really jarred her, how close he came to death. But she's interested in helping to protect other people who might get infected because you transmitted it. So I just wanted to put that out there before we went any further, and hopefully that answers some questions. Now, a lot of people have said, including Seventh-day Adventist Christians, if God created me with this really effective immune system and I'm abiding by the health message, why is it that I need to take a vaccine? Why is it that I'm not protected? And there's a good, easy immunobiology response to that because of the way your immune system is created. Your immune system has two arms to it, what we call an innate. It's built in. Even plants have this innate type of immunity to protect themselves, and lower animals. And then it has this adaptive arm that only higher level vertebrates and mammals have. The innate immune response is the immediate response. This is like being in the United States and you call 911, right? The fire department, ambulance, and police are going to show up. This is your early response, okay? When that happens, it is supposed to protect you. It is supposed to prevent you from having serious infection. But remember, I told you before that the reason we get disease is because the immune system is what? Overwhelmed. And with viruses that are so infectious, like COVID, the viral load can go up. That's that orange line that you're seeing. And when that viral load goes up, it means that the virus is getting a stronghold. But look at what happens when the adaptive immune response kicks in. You hear people talking about antibodies. This is the arm that produces antibodies. And antibodies are these Y-shaped proteins that are able to bind to a virus, for example, and prevent it from entering. This is where this kicks in. Now, I want you to notice that this black line is showing you time. This period here, where you have the purple line coming up for your adaptive immune response, that's exactly 2 weeks after infection. In other words, it takes 2 weeks after you've been first exposed to the microbe for this arm of the immune system to show up enough for you to detect it. Why? Because if you have a small infection, the innate immune system can take care of it. In other words, you don't want to call in the SWAT team or the US Army because you hear somebody breaking into your house. Number one, it's going to take a long time to deploy them. Number two, they need support systems. So they're going to have to pull a ship around to the side of the US where you are. They're going to have to set up offices and they have to set up their system. They're going to drive up tanks onto your lawn and destroy your roads. And the collateral damage is going to be significant and severe. If you notice, after the US Army has gone into an area, whether to liberate people or to defend the United States, the damage is so significant that they have to rebuild. This is what happens when your immune system gets turned on. And when this arm, this adaptive arm of the immune system kicks in. As a result of that, it only kicks in 2 weeks after the initial exposure. Not that it doesn't know that the microbe is there. It knows, but it takes a while to build up to this arsenal that it needs. The cells, initial cells, have to replicate and expand themselves. And I hope you get this because this is so very important. And this is the basis of vaccines. So here we go. It takes 10 minutes from the virus attaches to your cell to get in. Within 10 hours, the virus has already replicated itself. And its burst is about 10 to the 3, or about 1,000 viral particles. This is just 10 hours. And we're talking about 2 weeks for your adaptive immune system to show up in full force. So here we go again. On the bottom is time. And here's what happened. We call this the primary immune response. When you first encounter the bug, and here is time. This is right at 14 days. And that's when your antibody levels peak. But if you notice, it's not even that high. But look at what happens when it comes in the second time, if you see the same microbe again. Here's where it's introduced, and look at that. What took 2 weeks over here take a day now. And not only do you have a faster response, you have a much stronger response. And that is why some of these vaccines have 2 doses. So let's say this was the first dose of your Pfizer or your Moderna vaccine. You have this response, and what do? They wait about 3 weeks to a month to infect you, to give you the next one again, and then look at what happens. The levels of your protective response goes up. This now is what the vaccines do. The vaccines are not replacing your immune response. In fact, if you don't have a robust immune response, vaccines don't work at all. So what they do is that they prime your system. It says to your system, let me put this in your database. Let me send you an email about a really serious thing to expect so that when you see it, you'll know it. And so the vaccine sends that email, and your immune system has to go through the process of building up its arsenal, and nothing, not nutrition, it doesn't matter how healthy you are, that 2-week period will not be shortened. I'll say that again. It doesn't matter if you've been a vegetarian since birth. It doesn't matter how healthy you are. That 2-week period will not be shortened. That primary immune response cannot be replaced. So vaccines work because vaccines give you this initial response so that your body knows to expect this thing. So when you get it for real, you don't become sick and hospitalized and die. That's how the polio vaccine works. That's how the mumps and measles vaccine work. And that's how COVID-19 vaccines work. Okay? It's because of that delay in the adaptive immune response that you need to do vaccines. So now that I've given you that, what does the immune response produce? Apart from the memory cells and T cells and stuff, it produces what we call the cheap ammunition of an immune response. It's like the bullets that you fire from a gun in a war from soldiers. It's this Y-shaped protein that you hear everybody talking about now called an antibody. And what these antibodies that are made against the spike protein do is that they bind to it, just like you're seeing this image showing you, this cartoon showing you. And when it binds to it, here's the ACE2 receptor over here. And because this thing has something bound to it, it's like taking your key and wrapping duct tape around it. Now it can't fit in the lock. So as a result of that, you're locked out. And that's essentially what happens to the virus. So it's not that you don't get infected, it's that when you get infected, your immune system is ready to mediate this and you don't die from this type of infection. So here's a graph of everything that I just told you about the immune response. Here is where you're introduced to the virus. Initially, you probably have no symptoms. Then symptoms come on right around 5 or 6 days, you start having symptoms. The viral load, in other words, number of viruses in the blood goes up. And then your innate immune system is supposed to hold it down. But for people with severe and critical types of illnesses, look at how quickly that is happening. Between 6 to 8 days, you could be hospitalized, out of breath, having adverse respiratory infections that you can't breathe properly, admitted to the ICU and probably on a ventilator. That is well before the 14 days when your antibody response is going to peak. In other words, COVID can kill you way before that secondary, adaptive immune response kicks in. So if you take a vaccine, it prevents that. So let's now look then at the effect of vaccines. Here are two boys, same age, both of them were exposed to the smallpox virus on the same day. The one on the right was vaccinated, the one on the left was not. Look at the difference. That is the power of vaccines. So right now, there are 49 vaccines for COVID-19 in phase 1 clinical trial. What do we mean by that? They're just testing their safety in humans. Small numbers, about 40-something people in these trials. In phase 2, they have about 37 vaccines. On phase 2 trials, what they're essentially doing, they're checking for safety, but they're also checking to see if it works. And this has a few hundred people. And then you have another 27 vaccine candidates in phase 3 clinical trial. And phase 3 clinical trial is what you have, what we call a double-blind randomized control study, where they take people and they randomly give half of them placebo, literally like sugar and water or salt, and the next half gets the vaccine. Neither the doctor nor the person getting it know what they're getting. There's an oversight board that runs this, not the vaccine companies. And before the study gets underway, they set up specific timelines as to when they're going to go and pull the data to look who is who. So they'll say, at the time when we have 200 people infected, we want you to go and pull the data and look who is in the vaccine arm versus who's getting the placebo. Okay, so that's how clinical trials, phase 3 clinical trials work. And of course, there have been 4 vaccines that have been abandoned because they just didn't work out. Another 8 that have been approved in different places in the world. We have 3 here in the United States. And so we have the Pfizer, the Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines that have been approved. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are what we call mRNA vaccines that I'm going to explain to you in a little bit. And the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is what we call a viral vector vaccine based on how it is delivered. You can see, though, that there are a lot of other vaccines. You have the AstraZeneca vaccine that is the most broadly distributed vaccine. It also is a viral vector vaccine. You have the Gamaleya vaccine or the Sputnik 5. This is the Russian vaccine that they've been pushing. And then, of course, you have other vaccines like the Novavax vaccine, which is a protein vaccine coming out of the US here. It is in phase 3 trials. You have several other vaccines here using the inactivated form of the virus. In other words, they're using the whole virus that they kill. China has one of those that is developing, and India has one of those that is trying to develop as well. Those are in phase 3 clinical trial as well. So lots of vaccines on the horizon. I see that Pfizer actually put in to get full licensure of its vaccine. When that happens, that will significantly affect all of those other vaccines in the pipeline, because it means that most of those will not get emergency use authorization again, unless they prove that they're better than the Pfizer, right? Because that's what happens when you get licensure. So I'll explain the mRNA vaccine a little bit later, but for the viral vector vaccine, essentially what they do is that they get the sequence, the code that makes the spike protein of coronavirus, of SARS-CoV-2. They get the code for that. And they take that code and they put it into another virus called an adenovirus. This is a virus that typically causes the common cold. But with these, they have prevented them from replicating so they can't cause disease. In other words, they've just gutted them. So this cold virus that is the vector is actually a Trojan horse. You remember the story with the Trojan horse? Literally what they're doing is that they're using this virus to actually take in the spike protein of the coronavirus. And so this virus can infect your cells, but can't replicate. So when it infects your cells, in addition to making proteins of that virus, you make the spike protein of the coronavirus. And when your immune system sees that, it makes antibodies against it. Of course, those antibodies take, you know it, around 2 weeks to start showing up in good numbers in the body. For the RNA vaccine, we've never had RNA vaccines before. And so I'm going to take a little time to explain this to you. Here's a cartoon of a cell. And you can see all the different compartments of a cell. A cell is the smallest living unit that we have, right? It's self-sufficient, it's very efficient, it does its thing really well. The center part here that you see colored purple is the nucleus. And the nucleus is where the DNA of the cell lives, right? The DNA is what codes for all the proteins in your body, because you see, the goal of your body is to make proteins. Proteins are the workhorses of your body. For you to dissolve anything, for you to eat your food and digest it, that's proteins. You know, your amylase and all these other enzymes, chymotrypsase, and for your blood to clot, it's proteins. To rebuild tissues, proteins. So proteins are the workhorses. The goal of genes is to code for proteins. That is kept in the nucleus. In fact, the cell thinks it's so important to protect the DNA that it doesn't allow the DNA out of the nucleus of the cell. But the factory that makes the proteins that we call ribosomes are actually out here in the cytoplasm of the cell. So your cell is like a 2-bedroom or a 2-room house. The inner part is where the DNA lives. The outer part, you have lots of other functions, but you have proteins being made. So when the cell needs to make proteins, what it does is that it sends a message from that gene into the cytoplasm to the factory to say, here's what you make. I like to explain it this way. For those of you who grew up in the older times when we had to actually go to the library to pick up books so that we could do our assignments, you will remember that there were certain books that you couldn't take out of the library. They were on reserve. You remember that? When you had books on reserve? Because they didn't have enough copies of them. It was too rare to allow you to take out. So let's say, for example, you're going to make a really special pie for your mom for Mother's Day. And you want to be truly authentic. So you go and you've been searching for a good recipe to make this pie. And you realize that this lady from down south in the 1700s came up with this fantastic recipe. And they have collated them and put them in this rare book. It just so happens that this book is making the rounds across the country, and this is actually in your local library. So you say, I'm definitely going to make that for Mom. So you go down to the local library. You can't take the book out of the library, but they'll lend it to you for 1 hour. So what you do is that you go there, you borrow this book, and you take it to the photocopier, and you photocopy the pages, just the pages with that recipe. You don't, she has other recipes in there, but you don't need those today. You just need that for that special pie that you're going to make for Mother's Day. And you leave the library with that copy and you go to your kitchen. That copy that you take to your kitchen is what mRNA is. So people are talking about messenger RNA, and all it is just this copy of the message coming from the DNA, and it leaves the nucleus through these pores called the nuclear pore. And now when it gets in there, the factory makes it. It turns out that even viruses know that we have this factory, because that's actually how the coronavirus gets to make its stuff. Viruses are called obligate intracellular because they can't make their own proteins. So when they infect us, they have to get inside of our cells so that they can use our cells machinery or factory to make their own protein. In other words, when COVID-19 infects you, your body's making the spike protein for COVID-19, but it's also making all of the other 29 proteins that the virus has to make itself up. That's true for HIV, it's true for measles, it's true for everything. So essentially what the researchers did is to copy what the virus does anyway, except that you're not making 30 proteins, you're making one, the spike protein. And so they figured, and I'm gonna skip this, that once the virus was known in January of last year, they figured out the sequence for the spike protein. They got that sequence, they made a DNA template of it using a vector, and I don't need to get into technicalities. And then they sequenced and synthesized, in other words, making it in the lab, messenger RNA particles, based on research that they had done previously, because mRNA vaccines are nothing new. They had been working on this for 20-something years, right? And had done phase 1 clinical trials of it. So they knew that if you put in just the naked messenger RNA, it will get damaged. In other words, if you just photocopy those pages and walk out of the library with them, it's raining outside, they're gonna get damaged. So you put them in a folder that's probably protecting them from getting wet, okay? And that's what these nanoparticles are. So these are lipid nanoparticles that they encapsulate them in. When they inject it into your muscle, into the deltoid muscle on your arm, the muscle cells pick up that nanoparticle with messenger RNA in there. The lipid gets degraded and the messenger RNA gets read by the ribosome in your cells, and it makes spike proteins. And those spike proteins get displayed on the surface of those cells making it. They also get released and your immune system sees it and make these antibodies, these Y-shaped proteins. And those antibodies are floating around. So if the virus ever comes in, they bind to it and neutralize it. So here's an animation explaining.
mRNA technology has never been used before in an approved vaccine, but scientists are using it now to combat COVID-19. mRNA, or messenger ribonucleic acid, are snippets of genetic code that tell cells to build proteins. mRNA vaccines take advantage of that protein-building process to trigger an immune response and build immunity to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Instead of using a small dose of live or dead virus like some other vaccines, mRNA vaccines use a tiny piece of the virus's own genetic material. Here's how it works. This is the virus. These are called spike proteins. Scientists have isolated the genetic code for those proteins, a set of instructions that are put into the vaccine so your body knows how to make them. Your immune system won't make an actual virus particle, but it will make copies of the angry red spike protein. In other words, no gray ball, but an angry red spike. Once vaccinated, your body starts making those spike proteins so your immune system will develop antibodies to fight the real thing, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that are created for COVID-19 will be the first licensed mRNA vaccines ever.
Okay, so that's what happens. I'm going to skip over this immune response here for time, but I just want to show you quickly that even before SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 came around, RNA vaccines were being made. So here in 1992, you have the first known publication that I could find about mRNA being used for therapeutic purposes. But here in 2017, this is a phase 1 clinical trial, in other words, already in humans, trying to make a rabies vaccine from mRNA, right? So people say, oh, this is a new technology. It's new in the sense that we've never had a licensed vaccine for it, but it was being developed. Here again, in 2019, they're trying to make a flu vaccine from the mRNA template. Here is a Zika vaccine in April of 2020 that they were, again, in phase 1 clinical trials, right? This is from Moderna. And here again, you have a cytomegalovirus vaccine. In other words, this is something that I've been teaching about in my immunology class. So this is not a new thing, right? Here is an article in 2018, here's the date, in the journal Nature. Nature is one of those really top journals. mRNA vaccines, a new era in vaccinology. In other words, a new era in how to make vaccines from the traditional types of vaccines that we've made, and on and on. So in other words, it's not new. The other thing that people have trouble with is these nanoparticles. And I've heard people say, oh, they're using nanotechnology in these vaccines. You can't trust them. Well, all that nano means is that it's small. It's a billionth of a meter. So a nanoparticle is just referring to the size. You can make a nanoparticle out of any material that you can get to be small. So here is a scale for you. A baseball bat is about a meter in length. 1,000th of that is a millimeter, right? 1/1,000,000th of that is a micrometer. Because people also tell me that the government is putting microchips into these vaccines, so you have to be aware of them. But look at the size of a microchip. It will be right around here. But look at a nanoparticle. Remember, the vaccines are nanoparticle vaccines. That's 1/10000000th the size of a meter. In other words, it is that much smaller than a microchip, right? So a microchip couldn't fit in these vaccines because these vaccines are nanoparticle vaccines. So I hope that helps to clear up stuff for people as well. But what is actually in these vaccines? What's in them is this messenger RNA. This is a nucleic acid that has the instructions for making the virus. You have lipids, these lipids that, in other words, fat particles that are put together to protect the mRNA. They're made in these little balls. You have salts in it, and literally, if you know formulations for salts, those of you who are nurses or doctors, you'll recognize some of this salt because it's actually normal saline that is used to dilute this. So it's a 0.9% buffered saline, so that's why it has the other stuff in it. And a little bit of sugar as a part of the formulation. So sucrose is a sugar, and that's what's in both these mRNA vaccines. For the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it has the viruses in them, and it has salt solution in there that keeps it as a media. These vaccines are medications, and they do cause side effects. You can have pain at the injection site, which I never had when I took my vaccine, but I definitely had chills and fever on the second dose of my Pfizer vaccine. Some people feel fatigued, some people have headaches. This is expected, and it's the same thing for the Moderna. You have a certain percentage of people, up to 80-something to 90% of people will feel pain at the injection site, and another 60-something to 70% of people will feel fatigue. The reason for that is because your immune system is working. When your immune system is working fully, that actually leads to you having these types of symptoms overall. So it's not an unusual thing for you to have these symptoms. There are other people who have actually had anaphylaxis. A few people have had anaphylactic shock, in other words, a body-wide allergic response. And so that's the extent. You might also have heard that for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and for the AstraZeneca vaccine, there are people who have developed these rare blood clots. Like for every 1,000,000 people, you probably have one person who developed that clot. They haven't yet figured out why, but these clots can be deadly. They can actually cause serious disease, and a few people have actually died from having developed those clots. So they're in the process of looking at those. But what they do know at this point is that those clots develop in people, in females mostly, below the age of 50. And so the US has continued with giving that vaccine because they feel like the benefits outweigh the risk. But the vaccines now have something on it, have information on it that says that it can actually do that. Now, we've talked about the variants, and people have said, well, the vaccines don't work as well against the variants, and that's exactly true, because that's what the virus intends, to escape the immune response. However, I want to point out that the vaccines that we have here, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, work against all the different variants, just not to the same level. Remember, though, that if a vaccine is over 50% efficacious, it is licensed by the WHO and will be approved by the FDA. So essentially, the only variant that we're really concerned about is this South African variant, having gotten these vaccines, because none of these vaccines actually stand up against the South African variant. No vaccine that is currently made. And that is why both Moderna and Pfizer have gone ahead and made like a third shot that people could get if and when this variant actually starts spreading, for example, in the US. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. To date, over 1.2 billion people worldwide have been vaccinated by one of these 8 vaccines that I've shown you. So if people were dropping dead from being vaccinated, nobody would have to tell you, you would notice. Have the vaccines been helping people? Yes, they have. Here's a study that came out of a hospital in Texas, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, that shows you here are unvaccinated people and how many of them actually showed up getting positive for COVID. Then here are people with 1 shot, partially vaccinated, and that number already drops by about a half. But here are people who are fully vaccinated. So here you have over 230 something of the 8,000 people getting infected. Here you have just 112, and here you have 4 who showed up being positive. The vaccines do protect you from infection. Here again, signs that the vaccine is working. New York, California, New Jersey. These are a share of COVID patients in hospitals. All of those have plunged because of the vaccines. Here you're actually having different age groups, and you can see that the 80 to 60 something year olds, those were the people who got the vaccine first. They have the lowest levels of infection that you're seeing for hospital admissions. Their numbers plummet. So I want to talk with you about herd immunity, because if you have a disease and you get infected with a microbe, for example, and you go to the doctors and they gave you an antibiotic, that antibiotic will be able to lessen the number of microbes. Your immune system will end up clearing it, and you benefit yourself, unless it's a contagious microbe that you can give to somebody else. So it benefits you, but with vaccines, it's different. You have what is called herd immunity. And I want you to look at this animation. Here is where you have 5% of the people are vaccinated versus 75%. And you can see in the reddish brown color, the number of people who are infected in these scenarios of 5 versus 30 versus 75%. So for COVID, it is believed that you'll need to reach the place where you have over 75 or 80% of people being vaccinated in order to reach herd immunity. Now, let's say you have a variant that's much more infectious, like the B117 or the British variant, and maybe even the variant from South Africa. Now, here's a scenario where it's way more contagious, and even some of your vaccinated people in gray could become infected with that, because the variant would have found a way to evade even the antibodies that are produced. So the more of us who are vaccinated, the better. Now, I understand fully that we have a history, especially as people of color, with the US government running experiments on us, lying to us. You would remember the Tuskegee syphilis study, not to be mixed up with the Tuskegee study. That was a study of airmen who were Black to see if they could fly. But this Tuskegee syphilis study took place in Macomb County in Alabama. For those of you not in the US, Alabama is one of those southern states. And they took these 600 African-American men and lied to them about what study they were in. They told them that they were in a study where they were going to get insurance. And these men had syphilis, and the government, this is the HHS, Health and Human Services, continued this study and watched these men develop all of the sequelae, all of the symptoms, and died from syphilis. And even when penicillin came around and shown to be very effective, they prevented them, actively prevented them from getting the penicillin to treat their syphilis. And by the time the study ended, several of them had died, their children and their wives had gotten infected and had sequelae from it. And people know of these things, and it makes them scared. The current gynecological procedures were pioneered by this guy, Marion Sims, Dr. J. Marion Sims. However, it has come to light that literally all of these procedures were first performed on slave women without anesthesia. They were exploited with these painful procedures. And then, of course, Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was a young African-American woman in the early 1950s who went to Johns Hopkins University there in Baltimore because she had symptoms that suggested that she had cervical cancer. She eventually ended up dying, but they biopsied her cervix and took cells from her. And it was the first time they were able to grow human cells in the lab, and they commercialized it. In fact, I have used HeLa cells in my own research that came from her. They're still being sold. And when I buy a vial of HeLa cells, I have to pay anywhere from $300 to $500 US for it to use it for research. But her family didn't know. She didn't know before she died. And her family lived in poverty while billions of dollars have been made of these cells. These things have left people feeling totally not trusting the government. But here's the thing. These vaccines have been proven to be safe and efficacious. And if you take these vaccines, it will cause herd immunity to happen. I don't know if you know about what is happening with modern forestry. One of the things that we have problems with is these big forest fires. In modern forestry, though, when they plant new trees, they have these breaks, what we call fire breaks between them. So that even if you have one area develop a fire, it will burn out this area, but it won't jump over here and it won't jump over here because of these breaks. That's essentially what herd immunity is. It creates a fire break in you being able to transmit this infection if you have it. We know that it's been working. Why? Because nursing homes, 1/3 of all deaths from COVID-19 at the beginning of the pandemic came from nursing homes. My wife works at nursing homes. In the beginning, there were deaths almost every day. And look at how that number of deaths has plunged. When was the last time you heard of anybody dying in nursing homes? It says that the vaccine is working. And so I will end here and take your questions. But I hopefully you were able to get an idea of the science here and that you were able to understand the science and understand why it is that people like me, who has worked in immunology for all these years, actually trust these vaccines. The reason for that is because I've seen the science, I've seen all the data, and it aligns with what I know to be true, and the safety profiles are ones that I can trust.